5 years ago, Bob Klitgard, who was then the dean of the Rand Public School Public Policy PhD program, and I started having conversations on the application of principles used to fix companies applied to fixing countries. For that's what I do, as Robert has already mentioned. I've been the CEO of companies in the businesses of snowmobiles, swimming pool chemicals, industrial filters, home electrical components, industrial chemicals, blah, 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 blah. The reason to go through that long list is to tell you there's a lot of diversity there, proving I'm absolutely an expert on nothing. But I do have a ton of experience in going into organizations in which I did not have a background, unknown situations, and finding a way to get long-term, sustainable, and meaningful results. Those conversations with Bob led to an amazing trip in the Sudan in which we met with and interviewed hundreds of people. The warlords, the first president, the entire cabinet, local officials, Muslims, Christians, Arabs, blacks, merchants, ordinary citizens, hundreds of interviews, hundreds of points of view, understanding the culture in the country. I went there believing I could come up with ideas and new projects and programs that would work in Africa, even though many have not in the past. But I left with a radically different hypothesis, and that is that we, the outside world, had no idea what we were doing there and were primarily responsible for the decades-long Africa devastation. So I then launched into this 3-year project that I've been working on. My objective was to understand and then help improve what seemed to be an overwhelmingly counterproductive process, the interference and intrusion from developed countries and organizations into Africa. So I've created conclusions and approaches that are significantly different from those currently practiced. I've labeled them radically reasonable. Some of them may seem simple, but simplicity is a friend of getting results. I believe if followed, these would significantly improve Africa's chances for success. Before starting, there may be 3 questions that I thought might be in your minds. First, what in the world do companies have to do with countries? Well, of course, remember I'm only talking about dysfunctional companies and dysfunctional countries. And there are, of course, many differences, and we could make a list a mile long of the differences, but there are a lot of similarities. The constituencies of companies and countries both want to do better. The constituency of a country is its citizens, its institution, its governance, its neighbors, its partners. Same in the company, its employees, its customers. Everybody wants to do better, so there's a sort of a common goal. Leadership is very important. It really matters, and in both cases, it's always in short supply. Environmental factors, that's the conditions that exist, are really important. Companies' conditions or environmental factors are the markets in which they serve, the locations of their facilities, the nature of their workforce. In countries, it's their neighbors, their climatic conditions, their agricultural possibilities, whether they have domesticatable animals. Sound fundamentals are really important in both cases. In a company, you can't really run it well without an accounting system. A country can't perform very well if it doesn't have an adequate food supply. And cultural characteristics are critical and almost always ignored. I'd like to spend a little more time on this before I go back to questions 2 and 3 because it's so important. Bridging cultural gaps is critical for progress. When I go into a company, one of the first things I do is assess the existing culture. What is it? What can change? Where are the pressure points? I found it's really a critical assessment to do, but infrequently done. What is culture anyway? It's the culture of any organization is simply the makeup of its people, its thoughts, their desires, their fears, their attitudes, their hang-ups, their traditions, and their behavior patterns. They may not even understand themselves how they function. But cultural gap bridging is a tough issue. In the United States, over the last decade, 65% of the major mergers have been deemed to be failures in the sense that they decreased value. And almost always the blame for that is a lack of understanding of the cultural differences between the acquired company and the acquiring company. But you know, that should be child's play compared with the difference between outside agencies going into Africa. The difference between the cultures of two companies in the United States versus the outside world compared to Africa is just a momentous, larger task. So I'd like you to have an example, provide you one example to think about. Think about the United States in the 18th century. With its, we all have enough knowledge of history to know the level of disease and economic development and institutions and so forth that occurred at that time. Picture the world institutions of the year 2008 going into the United States in the 18th century, coming in with bags of money, ideas for new programs, hiring people for 50 times what they were working for otherwise, doing all of these kind of things that were so clashing with the culture of the United States. And imagine what the United States would look like today if that had occurred. So question number 2 is, what new do I bring to this African conversation? You know, thousands of philanthropists and economists and journalists and academicians and consultants have issued tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of documents on the subject of Africa. There's no dearth of opinion. But to the best of my knowledge, no one has ever applied a career of actually achieving long-term, sustainable, and meaningful results to this problem. So I did the usual stuff. You know, in addition to my visit to Sudan and interviews, I read over 70 books and fully took into account the content from economic analysis and professional studies and journalistic observations and practitioners' point of view, as everybody else did. But I added some other ingredients that I don't think are typically added, and that is those listed on the chart. They're not magical. It's dispelling myths like our products are the best, or challenging conventional wisdom like we must manufacture in China, but also just diving down into key issues, not accepting them on a surface level, using common sense, focusing on a few fundamentals, fixing first things first, using the available wealth of business and management lore, but most importantly having one agenda only, and that is achieving long-term, sustainable, and meaningful results. That list on the right may seem rather simple and rather straightforward, but from my experience and observation, it's very seldom applied in the aid and development world. The third question you may have in your mind is how all 40 countries of Africa could be viewed by me in one fell swoop. The reason it's 40, by the way, is that I've excluded South Africa and islands like Madagascar, because they really are very different. But in the remaining 40 countries, there are significant similarities. The aggregate and individual performance over the last 5 decades has been very similar. The cultural history, the colonization, independence issues, very similar. The disease, malnutrition, and lawlessness factors are very similar. But most importantly, the way the outside world interacts with these countries of Africa is very similar. So I felt very comfortable in dealing with these as one entity. So now that I've totally convinced all of you on these 3 issues, let's dive into the content. I've used many ways of looking at the issue of African performance. Economic statistics is the most often utilized. Despite the injection of almost $1 trillion in these countries over the last 50 years, it is indisputable that most of them are a mess. Look at the net income per capita history. Another parameter is the United Nations 2000 Millennium Goals that is created in the year 2000, setting goals for Africa to be achieved by the year 2015. 8 major goals. As of today, the scorecard on those 8 goals is, on 2 of them, there has been some minor degree of progress, way below the trend line necessary to achieve the goals. On the other 6, there's actually been regress. And so it's worse off today in all those 6 categories than when the goals were originally, than the benchmarks that were originally established. Yet some people have said, well, there's a recent surge in Africa because GDP in several countries are growing and there's a lot more building and construction and so forth. And that may be true, but 2 points of caution. If you take a slice through the African countries any time in the past, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, at any point in time you'll see 2 or 3 or 4 countries that have had a relatively good performance over the last several years. Then you take a slice 5 years later, and they're back down in the muck, and 2 or 3 others are up. Everybody says, well, they're doing well now. And then you take a slice another 5 years, and they're down in the muck, and another 2 or 3 are up. So there's a history, just like waves crashing on the shore, of these companies having a little blip and then going back down again. And secondly, most of that GDP surge in Africa over the last couple of years has come from commodities, oil primarily. It's generally accepted that a single natural element like oil, even though it increases the GDP of a country, does very little. In fact, has a negative influence on the economy at the grassroots level. There's other ways to look at Africa. There's insufficient time for me to go through all of these today, but I want to give you a glimpse. I took the dozen things that an investor looks at when making a decision to go into a company, like market share, like defense barriers, all those kind of things you look at. And I translated those into a country environment and then gave a scorecard. And I'd love to display that to you, but I don't have time. The bottom line is, so an investor in a company looks for long-term performance from that company. An investor in a country I've defined as a philanthropic investor who is putting aid and development funds in for the purpose of making the country get better over a period of time. The scorecard I unfortunately got when looking at these 12 factors investors use was all D's and F's. Focus of purpose is a key determinant of any organization's success. But when I saw the countries of Africa with dozens of cabinet ministers, even though they had less than 5 really capable people, with plans, the UN aid plan for Sudan had 40 different objectives. The UN Millennium Goals that I just discussed, the 8 goals, however, broke down into many, many other categories and spread across Africa. There were 2,000 individual items that were meant to be tracked and measured and adjusted to. When you see this kind of complete lack of focus, you know that the chances of success are slim. Another way I look at a business is the distractions that it faces and what barriers to success it has. Again, a dismal report when going through these countries. Getting a company to perform at a higher level than it ever previously attained is a tough task. I, as a turnaround person, don't usually take those on. I look for companies that used to do well and lost their way and to bring them back to where they were before. When I looked at the countries of the world that were significantly impacted by external influence, I found not a single country that was ever raised to a higher level of economic performance, primarily on the back of external intrusion. The worst report card came when I assessed the cultural cognition of the external agencies and governments, whether they understood what they were doing and what would be the result of their intentions. I assessed this report as abysmal, my lowest grade. So from every vantage point, from every point of observation, the interaction of the outside world to Africa had created a virtual impossibility for these countries to progress. And the economic data simply confirmed the conclusions. But these conclusions are way too macro to do anything about, so now I want to present a different way of thinking on specific subjects, non-conventional perhaps, controversial perhaps, but conclusions and approaches in which I totally believe would be helpful. I can't cover all the subjects in the book, so I picked these 6. First is food aid. You'll notice the headline, food aid creates starvation, and here are 7 reasons why. On item 1, farmers lose incentive. I'll tell you a story near the town of Luri in Sudan where the Samaritan's Purse, it's an NGO organization, and a young man named Jason came in 2 years before my visit there, bringing in tractors. They went to various farming villages around the area and 20 or 30 kilometers away. Talked to the farmers in each area, said, put your little farming plots together conceptually, communally wise. We will come in and plow and plant in the spring. You farmers weed and keep the cattle out in the growing season. We'll come in and harvest in the fall. The first year in all the various areas they went to was a complete success. The total grain output was more than double that had been previously achieved, and that was the norm. So the second year started, they did the same thing, went out, same thing is in place, they're happy with their program. Came back at the end of the growing season, the fields were a disaster. There was no grain, it was overridden by weeds. Obviously no one had attended to them. And they said, what happened? What's going on here? Well, they found out that the United Nations had decided that there was a drought in the area, and there actually was a little bit of one, but not one that would have damaged the crops that much, and flew in planes full of food aid. As soon as the planes full of food aid landed, farmers left the farms, abandoned them, got their food, and went on vacation, or whatever they did. You know, there's hundreds of, that's just one anecdote, but there's hundreds like that to prove the point. Point number 2 is obvious, I won't waste time on it. Point number 3 is exemplified by the photo. There's their kids unloading grain from a United Nations plane. We landed in Julus in northern Sudan. And as we were landing, there were nobody around. The plane landed and instantly appeared 20 kids to haul the food. I talked to one of them who spoke good English and said, "Hi, man, how you doing?" was his opening line. And and his closing line was, "Cool, dude, see ya." But he told me the schedule. He said they knew the schedule when the UN plane came in, and that's what their deal was. Every 2 weeks on Tuesday afternoon or whatever it was, they'd pop out of the bush at 3 o'clock, haul the bags back to the feeding centers. Number 4 and 5 are really a disaster. What happened? There's farmers out in their village and bad growing conditions, and they can only raise 50% of what is required to keep them alive, let's say. And so food aid is critical to keep them alive in the short term. But the food aid processes are such that they don't deliver it to each farm, deliver it to distribution centers, feeding centers. So these families have to pick up and leave their places and go to a feeding center. Well, the first thing that happens is the 50% of their requirements that they could have raised don't get raised. So it's a net loss from that standpoint. The second thing that happens is that they move into the center where they were previously distributed all over the landscape, where there's sanitation is awful and disease is awful, and so they get epidemics of diseases of various kinds, which are lots of diseases in Africa, and when you put people together, it always occurs. The third thing is they're in a trap. They can't get back. There's nothing to go back to. Whatever they had, the tools, if they had an animal, they're building, they're typically gone by roaming or herdsmen or whatever may be in the process. And so they're locked into the disaster pit by this process. It's not a very good outcome, even though technically they're living longer than they technically would have if they had stayed where they were. The last point I really want to emphasize, or number 6 I really want to emphasize, see many articles about the waste of food aid and other development funds going into Africa, and it's true, there's a ton of waste, but it's worse than wasted money or wasted funds or wasted energy, because everything that doesn't make it to its intended recipient doesn't do it because it's going to somebody that stole it. And those funds, those medicines, the food that are stolen are used to arm militias, to feed militias, the lawless side of the equation. So all of the waste side of this process, instead of just being lost, is arming, if you want to call them, the enemy, the lawless side of the society. There is a much better way. The current situation is awful, not only in deaths and disruption, but in permanent loss of mental capacities of those underfed. It's been said that a child growing up with malnutrition loses 15 to 20 IQ points. But why is it so bad? I mean, there's a lot of land in Africa. There should be, there's rain, there's a lot of water, it should have good growing conditions, because no one has done anything about it. Over the last 40 years, productivity in Africa has grown only 5%, whereas in the rest of the world, as you can see on the slide, it's 42, 23, 23, 31, all kinds of improved productivity in other regions of the world. The second thing is, as food got scarce, farmers who previously knew the wisdom of abandoning fields on a periodic basis to allow them to replenish themselves abandoned that practice. And so depletion of the soils, which previously in 10 or 15 years ago was around 40%, is now up at 75% and growing. I don't know if anybody knows that in a depleted soil, grain just doesn't grow, or it grows a very, very small amount. Africa uses less than 10% of the fertilizers used in Asia. very little hybrid seeds, and there's no agricultural training. It's bad now, but there's 6 trends that are all occurring in the wrong direction, creating a sextuple witching decade in front of us. Despite hunger, malnutrition, and disease, population expected to grow in Africa higher than any other region in the world. Urbanization is occurring at a more rapid rate in Africa than any other region in the world, taking workers off of manual farms. Depletion we already discussed. The warming and drought conditions are occurring pretty rapidly, as it's obvious from satellite photos that the Sahara Desert is migrating southward at a relatively rapid rate. Africa has the highest level of deforestation of any region in the world, 3%. 3% may not sound like much, but extrapolate that over 30 years and it's about all gone. When trees are not there, rain goes directly to the ocean through streams and rivers rather than sinking into the soil and into the water table. Amazing statistic, this deforestation occurs because Africa gets almost 50% of its fuel from wood. The highest region in the rest of the world, the highest number of the rest of the world is 2%, I think. And world food prices don't favor those who have shortages. But there is a better way, you know, and it's not that hard to conceive. It's not food aid, but it's production and productivity aid by the use of fertilizers and hybrid drought-resistant seeds and training. Pedro Sanchez, who is a world-leading agricultural economist, says that if those techniques were employed in Africa, given the amount of land and arable conditions, they could easily triple the outcome of food production. Think of tripling the outcome of food production in Africa. China accomplished this. They dedicated themselves and succeeded. It went from an environment 30 years ago where they had millions of people starving and 4 out of 5 people working were in the agricultural sector. Today they have basically a balance, and only 1 out of 2 people working are in the agricultural sector. That's giant strides, giant performance, and it was done purely by having a state-driven program that said farmers get to own their land by leases, basically, but you also want to use fertilizers, you also want to use hybrids, seeds, you also want to have training so you get the most out of the productivity possible. It can be done, and yet we, the outside world, have decimated Africa over the years with programs with titles like that are funded, you use money like how to increase the capacity and transparency of the public sector in Ghana, when we could be putting the same dollars towards training in fertilizers and hybrid seeds and do it in the right way. Later I'll discuss one method of implementation. Switching subjects, African leaders. Let me introduce you to 2. On the right with me, me being very dehydrated and decimated, as you may notice in the photo. That was a rough trip. With me is Commander Daniel Awedakir. He's a great guy. He has the most raucous, heartfelt laugh. He and I became great friends, as close as any 2 people could become in 3 or 4 days together with the radically different backgrounds that we have. Because his background was he was a military leader for the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, and by his own measure, and telling me with a hearty, accompanied with a hearty laugh, killed hundreds of Arabs with his own machete. So that's Commander Akir. The gentleman on the lower right-hand corner is John Garang. John Garang is 20 or 25 years ago put together the 13 warring factions of South Sudan, not single-handedly, but by his own willpower. They were 13 warring factions. They were completely at the mercy of the Arabs in North Sudan because they had no entity, no weapons, no organization of any sort. And that sounds like, and he got them together and they created a power center and they started being able to fight against North Sudan and got the demarcation lines where they should be and eventually wound up being in a truce. That sounds all very noble, but when you read the history of it, tens of thousands of people were killed in the process, including them killing their own people, and ravaging villages were decimated and populations were wiped out. And I mean, it was a very, very bloody, messy process. But he also has a PhD from the University of Iowa, and he speaks 6 languages fluently and eloquently. An enigma of a person you never met. Unfortunately, he died a couple years ago After all of that stuff, all that he went through, probably having his life on a limb, hundreds of times, he died in an accidental helicopter crash. But anyway, African leaders it's a woeful history. You talk to a lot of people and they say, that's what's wrong with Africa, it's their leaders. And to a large degree, it's true. There's been a history of criminals, thugs, corruption, you name it. But there's more to it, and it's not quite that simple. I'd like to tell you, break corruption down into two pieces. First piece is economic corruption, which is stealing. Second piece is I've called power corruption, which is violating the Constitution, and especially as it relates to term limits. So economic corruption is caused by the African leaders, but we, the outside world, have provided all the fuel for this. And this is the way it works. A new leader comes in place. The UN, the IMF, the World, United States Aid come in and say, these are the things we need you to do. He hears, these are the things you need me to say. So he says the things we want him to do. We then give him bags of money. He then does what he wants. It's happened 50 times. You can go through it's a cycle. It's a great guy, and then all of a sudden he's an awful guy. But we provided the fuel for that instead of all kinds of different approaches that could have been taken. And I witnessed John Garang. We sat in a cabinet meeting, just two outsiders and the entire cabinet of South Sudan, and he made an eloquent speech on corruption. It was spellbinding. It was a Barack Obama type of speech. And we'd sit there and say, wow, that's really great. That night at dinner, a guy from the UN came in and said, how'd you like that speech? And we said, it was really good. He said, I wrote it. He said, okay. He said, I wrote it for him. Well, okay. Now, he said, this is a UN guy, now that he's delivered it, I'm going to take it back to the UN because I can use it to provide tons of money to come into the process. I actually saw that happen right in front of my eyes. Proved the point. But you can't excuse economic corruption. It's just debilitating to these countries. But boy, we, the outside world, have had a big, giant hand in making it happen. Now, power corruption. Same thing occurs. We go to a new leader, say, you get a bag of money if you agree to a constitution, to elections, to term limits. Okay. But there's no history in the African tribal culture of having term limits. There's not such a thing of, I'll be chief for a while and then I'll step down and lead a good life for the rest of my life. Being an ex-president in Africa is not a good job. Being an ex-president in the United States is a good job. But there are more ex-presidents living in the United States today than there are ex-presidents in Africa living in their country in which they were president in all 40 countries. Tells you something. So a good guy, somebody that could cut down on the corruption, economic corruption, and is doing his best. Well, let's take Moveri Museveni in Uganda. Has worked on women's rights. He's cut down on corruption dramatically. And he was viewed as one of the new African leaders that was really going to do well. Towards the end of his second term, all of a sudden, according to outside observers, he became a bad guy because he started beating on the legislature in various ways to change the Constitution so he could stay in power. How do you blame him? There's no history, there's no culture of just giving it over to somebody else. I'm doing a good job. Who can do as well as I can? I just think that's a fault of the outside world to impose our kind of democratic ideals or our forms of democracy into countries that aren't geared to them. Microcredit, panacea, save the world. If you don't know what microcredit is, it's lending a small amount of money to a person or a group of people without collateral, without credit history, for the purpose of them putting together a small business, being successful in that business, paying back the loan, growing, getting another loan, hiring more people, creating grassroots economic power. What could be wrong with that? That is, so cool. That is exactly what we all think ought to make sense. Bypasses the corruption levels of the government. It works at the grassroots level. It's an exciting thing to do. And Eunice and the Grameen Bank won a Pulitzer Prize for this concept. They were getting 98% repayment rates, which everybody was amazed at, with poor people with no credit rating and no collateral getting 98% repayment rates. And I thought, this sounds really good, but I also said, this sounds too good to be true. And I'm a skeptic. So then I started seeing all kinds of other organizations jump into the process, not with the characteristics that the Grameen Bank did, and people saying things like, it's really a good program even if they don't pay it back. I said, uh-oh, here we go. So again, it's important to any problem to challenge a conventional wisdom, to break something down into its components. And I looked at the 3 possible outcomes of a loan to such a person. Outcome number 1 is they start a business successfully. The loan is repaid. They get larger loans. People are employed. Everybody wins. Outcome number 2, the funds are used for consumption instead of building a business. Or the business fails, and they just abandon the obligation and don't repay it. Option number 3 is the funds are used for consumption, or the business fails, but they repay it by getting a street loan. So they originally get a bank loan for 20% a year, spend it on whatever, have to pay it back, feel obligated to pay it back, find the guy on the street that's going to lend them the same amount of money for 20% a month. So in those 2 last cases, they're pretty bad outcomes. But my conclusion on this is, with a high degree of legitimate repayment, legitimate repayment, I mean coming from the business creation, not from another loan that somebody paid, this is really a good program, and it's a key to success. But without it, it's a tainted handout, and it's culturally depleting program. A handout would be better. To maximize legitimate repayment, the conditions are critical. And Grameen Handab, and unfortunately almost everybody else that's jumped into this equation did not have them. An established bank with trained personnel, know how to interview people, know what questions to ask them. Don't fall for the sob stories. My daughter needs a new hairdo or whatever. But ask the good questions so that at least there's a chance that they're using it for business. And an intense follow-up process. So they had 100 people for each staff person, and they followed up every single week with each of these people that borrowed money to see that they were on track and what they were doing and try to help them out in the process. And it's done for profit, not mixed objectives. It's done in a reasonably lawful society. It's done in a society that's not used to a tremendous degree of aid handouts. There's no prevalence of street lenders. There are a lot of conditions that are necessary to make this work effectively. Unfortunately, many other places that have started up in this only have some of those conditions or sort of have a hybrid objective. It's partially for economic development, partially as a philanthropic. I hope they do a business, but if they really need the money, we'll excuse the loan kind of thing, and that just leads to disaster. As an example, in India, the experience is not so good. Only 25% of those people that were lent money actually used it to try to start a new business. 75% of them used it just for consumption. So for the majority of their borrowers, we had a path to either moral decline by violating one of the first and only contracts that this family or individual would ever enter into, or economic destruction by overspending and now falling into the hands of the street gangs. This group of people in Sudan was very interesting, and I would use them to explain a little bit further on the story of microcredit. You might find this unusual, find a bunch of Muslim ladies meeting together and meeting with me and another guy, both things that are pretty much taboo in any Muslim society. The reason this occurred was for the prior 6 or 7 years before we got there, this village had been attacked constantly by the Arabs in the town just several miles away. And they blew up the buildings and killed the people and came in constant raids, and it was just constant, one after another. And one day the men of the village said, we're leaving. We're going to take everything and we're going to move far away from this Arab village because we just can't put up with this anymore. And these ladies said, go ahead if you will, but leave your weapons because we're staying and going to keep fighting. So in that process, they gained a stature that hardly any women's group or individual women have ever achieved in any Muslim society. And their organization was, or the purpose of its organization was they made money by sewing little things and making towels and stuff and doing babysitting, and they used those funds to help support the orphans in the town. Well, After I left, a long time after that, I was thinking through this microcredit issue, and I said, darn, I wish I'd have thought of it at the time. I'd have just given them the money to buy a sewing machine. It would have been the best $300 I ever spent in my life, because it would have been fantastic. But I spent days thinking through what would have happened if today I or some organization went in and lent them the money for the sewing machine. And it's a quite lengthy process to try to tell you all the scenarios. Do you put a surrogate in place that's a local person? Do you fly in every week? You know, how do you do it? But you didn't have an existing bank or any of the conditions that I said were precedent. And I decided that it would be the worst thing we could do for these ladies to give them a loan. We've all heard enough about AIDS over the years. It's devastating. 20 million dead, 9 years life expectancy decline across the entire continent of Africa. 23 million people infected, mostly women, impacts families. It's even worse than that. Because of all the disease, there's been a big influx of donated and cheap drugs, and it blew out the existing pharmaceutical industry in Africa. It doesn't exist any longer. The value of the drugs stolen feeds illegality. For example, Ghana, a year ago, 80% of the antiviral drugs that went into Ghana never made it to the patients. They went into the illegal underground network. And the intrusion of many health organizations has basically decimated the nurse and doctor communities. At one recent point in time, in Ghana, 600 out of 900 trained nurses and doctors had left the country. In Zimbabwe, 840 out of 1,200 had left the country. In Zambia, 550 out of 600 had left the country. I'll explain in a moment why that occurs. But here's a tale of two countries. Uganda. 15 years ago, 15% incident rate. They instituted what's called an ABC program. A is abstinence, B for be faithful, C for condoms. They didn't just institute it by banners and sayings and placards. This was through the community, the church leaders, the local leaders. It was just a way of life. It became their mantra of everybody in the country. And they got the incident rate down from 15% to 5% over a 10-year period. Quite extraordinary. The Harvard study, looking at the whole issue of HIV/AIDS in Africa and other places, estimated the cost at $16 per year per life saved in this program. It wasn't a big expenditure program. It was a big energy and heartfelt commitment program. Now let's go to Botswana. 6 or 7 years ago, the Gates Foundation and Harvard and some medical companies decided to put a major thrust into Botswana to treat the immense population of HIV/AIDS patients. After 5 years, all the planning was done, hiring was done, and they, in their first year, met the target of treating 58,000 people in the first year, an immense number. But the total population of patients in Botswana is 280,000. But doing this 58,000 treatment, on the surface you'd say, wow, that's great, that's really a big accomplishment, and it was. But there was a lot of collateral damage. All the other health care in the entire country was decimated. Every single public health person was sucked into the HIV/AIDS silo. They needed everybody in the country and surrounding countries to deal with 58,000 patients with antiviral medications. So malaria, child care, prenatal care, every other disease just had no treatment whatsoever. It was completely gone. Second thing that happened is that all of these workers who were making up a number, I don't know exactly, were making $5 a week, let's say, in their previous jobs, who now were hired into the HIV/AIDS program at $50 a week, became exposed to the external healthcare agencies, and they said, wow, you're making $50 a week, but we really need a lot of people in some other part of the world, and they're paying $200 a week. And so every year since this has been in place, 60% of the existing healthcare, public health people in Botswana have left, migrated. Each year, 60% leaves. And this is a huge program. When the amount of money that it takes to treat the 280,000 people in Botswana on a pro rata of GDP versus United States GDP is equivalent to us having 2 Iraq wars simultaneously. But the worst part of this whole thing, I mean, some of that's good news and some of it's mixed, but the worst part of it is there was no prevention program put in place. And so while all of this is going on, incident rate is growing 8% per year. Can't catch up. This is it's no win situation. The same Harvard study that said was $16 per year life saved said it's over $1,000 per year per life saved for antiviral treatment. And the life saved aren't the same quality of life in general as the life saved from not getting it in the first place, because there are a lot of secondary diseases that occur to people and so forth in the process. But this is applying a Band-Aid to an egregious life-threatening wound, and excuse me, but it just doesn't make any sense. So here's what I propose. Many countries are too lazy or self-righteous to seriously implement prevention, but they get antiviral treatment anyway. And HIV/AIDS cannot be solved without a giant prevention program. So here's what you do. Step one, you go to various countries and say, install a real ABC program. Not billboards, but really one that works. Step number two, prove that you're doing it by getting results, measuring the incident rate. So we're not just saying do something, spend money, but actually get some results. As you do that, you earn antiviral help. So you use some formula so that the same, whatever, if there's 100,000 antiviral medications going into Africa before this, you still have 100,000 going in the next day and the same number of people getting treated, just a formula. But the distribution of where it goes is different. It goes to the countries that are helping themselves. Now, in the worst case, the same number will get infected and the same number will get treated because none of the incentives work and nobody changes their behavior patterns. But there's only upside potential to this, and at least allows the possibility that over time, several countries will take on what Uganda took on because they can rid their entire population, mostly through prevention, but partially through earned antiviral medications. Red tape in Africa is astounding. I'll give you some statistics. In Nigeria, getting a license requires 46 procedures and 241 days. Getting export trading approval requires 9 documents, 29 signatures, 71 days. In Zambia, a business license takes 1.5 years. Also, 10% of the workforce only is legally employed. 90% are illegally employed. In Niger, building a warehouse, getting the license for it takes 27 procedures and half a year. 17 of the bottom 20 worst countries to do business are in Africa. All of these conditions, and there are minimum wages that are way above what anybody would ever think of paying. There's maximum hours that are way below what anybody would ever think of having their employees work. Many countries have 8 weeks vacation. It's just crazy. These regulations and provisions came about in 2 ways. Some of them came from the outside world saying, we will give you this bag of money, this program, if you put in place minimum wages and maximum hours and big vacations and all these kind of things that developed countries have and can afford to have. And the second came about as a way for the corruption to just go down through the process where nobody earns a real living. Everybody is just taking a nick out of a license and it's sucking it out of the economic engine. India had the same problem. In 1991, the finance minister's name was Singh, I believe, instituted overnight a policy which was called abolishing the license Raj. They had the same kind of thing. Everybody was making all the money off of licenses and permits and so forth in the process. And that was one of the key things that enabled India to start on the path that they've had over the last 15 years of pretty much progress. They're still very, very bureaucratic, but this whole license Raj was abolished by the finance minister. The same thing can be done in any of these countries. It just takes government will. It doesn't take any medications or money or anything. It just takes government will to get done. The outside world ought to refuse to do business with any country in Africa that doesn't show the will to take care of these red tape issues that are just completely get in the way of any kind of economic development. Lawfulness is one of the foundation elements that enables any society to function. You need a police force that's not bribed. You get that requires government will and the wonder of communications. This may seem simple, but as I mentioned earlier, simplicity is a friend of getting results. You put in place a police force. You pay them reasonably well. I know any of these countries could get the funding for a police force if they knew the nature of the entire program from outside sources. One of the things you do is you pay as you go. Rather than giving them $50 million up front, you say each month you submit an invoice for the salaries, and we'll put the money into your bank when you pay the things and so forth in the process. So there's very little opportunity, temptation for the country or opportunity for bribing. You tell all the policemen that are hired, you do one bribe and you're fired, and you lose your job and you never get it back. But that's fine. You can tell people all you want. But the most important part is you have a continuous communication to every citizen, which is easily done by radio, and says every single day, don't bribe a policeman, don't bribe a policeman. You'll cause him to lose your job, his job. You cause him to lose his job. You just say it over and over and over again. When those bribing occurrences occur, you got people on both sides of the equation that know the price paid for a bribe. I've seen, you saw what Uganda did with their ABC program, which was just constant, repeated, continuous communications of the same message. I've seen it and done it myself in several companies where we had to make a major cultural change. We just said the same thing to everybody over and over and over and over and over again and practiced it. And it's amazing how the molecules line up when you do that over time. I know that sounds simple, but to repeat for the third time, simplicity is a friend of getting results. So here's a highly condensed and abbreviated bottom line of things that do not work. The vast majority of everything that's been done to date. Dealing with results instead of causes, as I mentioned, as in the food and HIV areas. Leading with money up front, as in loans and programs that are funded up front. Being ignorant of cultural issues is not requiring African leadership. Injecting unwanted programs. In South Sudan, there was one location where people in the village were just laughing. It's a shame. 2 outside NGO organizations were building hospitals about a quarter of a mile apart. And in this part of Africa, there's no wheels. Everybody walks. There's not even bicycles. There's no way to transport except by walking. And so the concept of having 2 hospitals built right next to each other was about the most ridiculous thing they could think of. Let alone the fact that neither of these organizations had any idea how they were going to staff. There was no medical people in the area or how to operate these. But on their brochures, when they told their donors how they were doing, they could show a picture of a hospital in a desolate area. And 5 years from now, I'm sure they'll all be decrepit and the buildings down because nobody there needs them, wants them, understands even what they're for. Also, what doesn't work is demanding idealized governance issues, as in term limits, and attempting to raise a country's economy primarily through outside interference. It never works. But these do work. Now, some of these are just the flip side of the prior slide. I'm sorry for that, but treat causes, not results. Do prevention programs, do food productivity programs, not treatment and food aid. Don't lead with money. Originate programs locally or get true buy-in occurring very, 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 very early. Africans need to run or co-run the show. You know, all developing countries, all countries in the world, when they were in their developing mode, the ones that are today successful, ran their own show. They may have done it sloppily, they may have done it in an extremely inefficient way viewed by the 21st century standards, but they did it and they got through the process. Assisted self-help should be the mantra of everybody that is involved in these countries. Africa's chosen form of governance is their business. And the foundation must be built before economic growth can occur. The ingredients for that foundation are self-sustenance, a lawful society, and disease control. With those 3 things only, economic development can sprout. Without all 3 of them in place, it will not. And the measure of that is whether the citizens truly believe that they can make their lives a little better over time by their efforts and energy. Once you get an amount of citizens that feel that they can do that, by their energy, they can actually make themselves better over time because their environment will allow them to do that. Then you get the beginning foundation for progressive society. I mentioned earlier that on the subject of food aid, I'd give you a plan. Here's one approach that takes all the factors into account, the ones that work and the ones that don't work, applied to the subject of food. I've used the term college, even though this isn't truly a college, because there are a lot of unions of South African countries, like the South African or the African Union, that are so political they can't do anything because they get tangled up in their political inter-country underwear. But it's not a college in a true sense, but it's similar to the U.S. land-grant colleges of the 1860s, where they had an agricultural mission. These would be founded either in a country or in a group of countries or across Africa, but let's just say one country for a moment and call it Chad for like another country. The ag minister of Chad would be the person that's responsible for this program. The contributors to the college would be all of those agencies that have capability, that have funds, that have access to fertilizers and to hybrid seeds and world knowledge of what things work in different climates. And they'd create a plan for Chad. And people would buy into it and say they would contribute to it if Chad implements it. Well, Chad's part of the role is to hire umpteen number of trainers, people to go out in the field that get trained on whatever these programs are, to go out and implement it. And then the outside agencies work through an African organization. They fund it as a pay-as-you-go basis. When results come in, it gets better. The deal is the funds are now going to achieve something that has long-lasting value, and that is increased productivity. This concept applies to almost anything else. It's just a simple measure of taking all of those factors that do work and eliminating all those that don't work and put it in place. So I'll leave you with 3 quotes from famous philosophers. The first one, Peter Drucker, the person that converted management practices into a liberal art, and whose phrase here is the inspiration for the title of my book: good intentions are no excuse for incompetence. An even earlier philosopher also understood the issue of implementation and details and getting things done. As Shakespeare said, it's not if to do were as easy as know how to do, all paupers' cottages would be princes' castles. And one last one, it's not what you intend to do, it's not even what you do, it's how you do it. Me. Thank you.